done. That was orchestrated chaos. That's what that was.
Not to me an accident or coincidence that you picked a football field on a Sunday to make this kind of scene. And why do you make this?
Now, why did Stephen A. Smith say that? He said you waited until you were on the football field on a Sunday. Because he's finally starting to notice that all of these theatrics are purposefully being done during the games. It's not because they're trying to get attention for a cause. It's because they're trying to get attention for themselves.
For exactly what reason? Because you feel that Malcolm Jenkins and the Players Coalition co-opted the situation. Well, how did they co-opt it? You had your issues in support of Colin Kaepernick. They were saying the issue is bigger than Colin Kaepernick. We appreciate Colin Kaepernick. We spoke to him on many occasions. We tried to get him involved. But nevertheless, he chose not to join with us, which we respect. So we're going to go about the business of getting a kind of deal where ultimately... I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Can I ask you a question?
Look at Stephen A.'s face. He said, I'm sorry. Did I not tell you that if you're not black, I don't want you in this conversation, bitch? Let's go to commercial. I got to talk to you.
Because how I understood the events is differently than how you understood the events. So I want to make sure we're on the same page here in the audience. From what I understood is Eric Reid actually started the movement along with Colin.
Well, you're already off base because Eric Reid didn't start a damn thing. She said, as far as I know, Eric Reid started along with Colin Kaepernick. No, Eric Reid didn't start shit. So you're already off to a bad start.
Malcolm Jenkins might have got involved later with the Players Coalition when that was developed. And then why Colin Kaepernick and Eric Reid backed out is because Malcolm Jenkins was agreeing to a deal with the NFL to essentially sell the movement. Jeff.
To sell what movement? What movement are you talking about? To make sure that you kneel on one knee like you're proposing to the NFL movement? That's what you're talking about? See, Molly Qerim is one of these woke dingbats, and she's getting a lot of these ideas pumped into her head by Jalen Rose. Because now that she's married to a so-called black man, she thinks that she can speak on so-called black issues with some level of certainty. At the end of the day, I mean, if we really want to play the you stole this idea from me game, Marshawn Lynch could tell both Eric Reid and Colin Kaepernick, well, both of you motherfuckers stole my movement because I've been sitting on the bench for the national anthem for 10 years. So, I mean, if we're going to do that, we can go back to Marshawn Lynch, and I'm sure that there was somebody before him. So this nonsense that somebody was stealing a protest or stealing a movement, there's no movement going on here. Because Colin Kaepernick, he cannot even articulate what it is that he actually believes in or adheres to. So somebody had to move this whole thing forward to a resolution. Malcolm Jenkins did it. Get over it. Oh, well.
Could please hold on for 1 second. To essentially sell the movement for $100 million and agree to no longer protest.
So wait a minute. Malcolm Jenkins, quote unquote, sold the movement for $100 million. So they got $100 million to go and disperse to the various so-called black communities in America. $100 million that, to be quite frank with you, the owners did not have to allot to them at all. At all. They did not have to allot one penny to any of the players for any of the issues that they were talking about. And supposedly they sold out the movement. I thought that the point was that you wanted the owners to assist you in fundraising for any of your ideas or the things that you were concocting so that you can assist the so-called black community in improving itself. I thought that that's what the alleged movement was supposed to be about. At least that's what Malcolm Jenkins articulated, and he followed through on that. What Colin Kaepernick actually wanted, who knows, because supposedly he never showed up to the meetings even though he was invited. Now, as we know, there are various versions to that story.
That's why they were referring it to being sold out, or he was selling out the movement, because that was his movement.
Well,
is that what you also understood? Is that what?
How could it be his movement if what he's doing is supposed to be for so-called black people? What type of leader is that concerned about getting credit?
That's basically my understanding with a few different nuggets here.
Okay.
We are under the impression that Colin Kaepernick's protest led to that meeting with the owners. That is false. Colin Kaepernick protested, but it wasn't until September of 2017 when Donald Trump at a rally in Huntsville, Alabama, said that the players should be fired that everything stirred.
I agree with you, Stephen A. Smith. As a matter of fact, I did a few videos on that where I stated that without a doubt in my mind, the reason why Donald Trump did that was to instigate the firestorm that came thereafter so that all of the dissenting players could be smoked out and the NFL owners would be forced to bring this whole situation to a resolution. And it worked.
One could easily make the argument that it wasn't about Colin Kaepernick's protest, because Colin Kaepernick's protest alone, in concert with Eric Reid and others, would not have gotten the owners to the negotiating table. It was the fact that Donald Trump had said the incendiary comments that he had said about the players, which really stirred it and elevated it to another level, where more players joined in, and as a result, it forced the owners to come to the table. There was nothing about the Colin Kaepernick protest that forced that meeting. So if you're Eric Reid, you know this.
Right, but does he know that, Stephen A. Smith? You're assuming a lot of things about Eric Reid in regards to how his brain should work. You're assuming that his brain functions on a high enough level to recognize continuity and what he should attribute to what. I'm not going to give him that much credit, because idolaters normally are not very swift. And even amongst the idolaters that do seem to possess a certain amount of intellect, once they go all in on man worship, they lose what little intellect they have.
You know this. Why are you acting that way? And then act like because somebody disagrees with you. That's a problem that only exists in our community. Other people, I shouldn't say that because I don't know how other communities think. Let me apologize for that. What I will say is this: we're sellouts. Folks are sellouts when they disagree. How is it that we can't simply disagree intelligently, explain our positions as to why, and move on, as opposed...
That's easy, Stephen A. Smith. The answer to that is very, very easy. It's because, let's be for real, there are far too many so-called black men in the so-called black community that think and act like a bitch. I'm just going to be real about that. There are too many so-called black men who think like bitches, who think like a damn woman on her menstrual. And that's just the fact of the matter. And they're all over the internet. And to be quite frank with you, I think that you allow what people say about you to affect you a little bit too much. Because even though I said that there are far too many so-called black men that act like that, there are even more so-called black men who understand how to have a conversation and who understand how to bring forth substantiation for their assertions. I'm not going to give you a percentage on which is which and how many are here and how many are there. But I do believe that for the most part, there are a lot of silent and intelligent so-called black men out there who just prefer to just stay in the background because they don't want to have to deal with a lot of these rabid dog, super liberal blacks, so-called blacks, who want to argue and possibly get violent just because you disagree with them. And the fact of the matter is that, and I've brought this up before, a lot of these niggas got to go. They either have to be reformed or removed, because you cannot build a strong community with too much dysfunction. And a lot of them have to go. But you'll notice that they're quick to call people coons and sellouts whenever they have an idea that differs from what they see on social media. But they won't call the drug dealers. They won't call the gang members. They won't call the women having 4 and 5 abortions. They won't call them sellouts, and they won't call them coons. Isn't that funny?
Giving credence to those that were looking at us, and you looking at Eric Reid yesterday, and you know what proponents of Donald Trump in his position were saying? You see, this is what we were talking about here. But there's a...
Well, you know what, brother, be quite frank with you, and I've already stated this. So-called black people are so far away from understanding how unimportant it is what the Caucasian thinks about what so-called black people are doing. We have to do the right thing because it's the right thing, and because we're doing right by our brother and by our sister, as opposed to worrying about not doing the right thing because of how it's going to look to the so-called Caucasian. As long as you're that worried about how they feel about what we're doing, you're never going to get the respect from them that you're so desperate for. People start to respect you when they see that, number one, that you respect yourself, and number two, that you're not going to be too affected by what they think about you. They might not like you as much, but they're going to respect you a lot more.
To be about black unity, and look at them. It's embarrassing.
Appreciate you explaining that. Hold that thought. There's a lot more to get into. I see Max chomping at the bit. He wants to respond. More First Take after the break. Don't go anywhere. All right, if you're just joining us, we're discussing the situation that recently happened between Eric Reid and Malcolm Jenkins at the Eagles-Panthers game, and essentially Eric Reid called Malcolm Jenkins a sellout for hijacking and then selling Reid and Colin Kaepernick's movement to the NFL for $100 million. And
no, he's just mad because Malcolm Jenkins won't bow down to his boo thing.
Max, I know you wanted to
Well, first of all, I want to say, Stephen A., actually, your point about you feeling uncomfortable when someone who's not African-American is discussing this is actually well taken. I don't feel that way personally. I think social consciousness, anyone can have it, but if you...
I think that anyone can have a sense of propriety and justice. When you're talking about social consciousness, you're talking about what you think is best for other people, which seems to be very pervasive amongst the super liberal Caucasian Jew. As I've stated, when you want to understand who it was who tends to concoct most of the methodologies that are used by all of these so-called pro-black or civil rights groups, it's almost always a super liberal Caucasian Jew or a conglomerate of super liberal Caucasian Jews that work behind the scenes. Whether it's Martin Luther King and Stanley Levinson, or the fact that just about every NAACP leader has always been Jewish, it always happens over and over and over again.
Go through something personally, you won't understand it the same way. So I actually appreciate that point. I want to say something about what Eric Reid's real beef is here. He thought the details of the deal were bad. And basically the idea was not just that the players couldn't decide where the money was going to go, but the money itself, which wasn't quite $100 million, was already money that was there and earmarked for other things. It was just being shifted over. It wasn't an additional investment by the owners, and the players would all...
So in other words, what you're telling me is that if you're broke and you go to a person that only has $100 in their pocket, they have five $20 bills in their pocket, and they say, okay, I'm going to give you $20 out of this $100. You're going to be upset with them because they gave you $20 out of the $100 that they have in their pocket, as opposed to going to the ATM machine and getting you a crisp $20 bill? That's what you're going to be mad about? Okay.
Lose control about the way it was invested. So he thought on the details they were getting, it was like a shell game, and they were getting...
No, what he thought was that that the NFL owners should have their feet held over the fire to be extorted, to allow themselves to be extorted. That's really what this was about. They wanted to break the will of the NFL owners. When I say they, I'm talking about the people with Kaepernick's and Eric Reid's mindset, because it's very clear that they were acting as proxies for Black Lives Matter. I have very, very little doubt about that. And of course, Black Lives Matter is proxy for George Soros, who, by the way, had an issue at his home today where somebody tried to send him an explosive package. See, it's far more difficult to manipulate from the shadows today than it was 30 or 40 years ago. Now with the internet, people are able to follow paper trails. So it's going to be very interesting to see how many of these events transpire. But at the end of the day, when you're asking someone for money that they don't owe you, you don't have the ability to tell them that they have to give you fresh money as opposed to the money that they already plan to spend. You should just feel fortunate that they're going to give you the money in the first place, especially since, based on the buying power that our people have, we have enough money to empower ourselves if that's truly what we want to do.
Ripped off, and it was being co-opted by the NFL. And when he says sells out, he means that literally. You're selling out, and it's not even a good deal. I think Eric Reid has a point.
Well, of course you think that he has a point. He's an agent of chaos, and so are you. That's why you're going to have your hand in his back.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing, Max. Okay, everyone can have an opinion about how the money was allocated, where the money comes from. But for me, the bigger overall issue is the public display that Eric Reid had in the game, because at the end of the day, what good does it do to have that type of confrontation with Malcolm Jenkins at that point in time in regarding Colin Kaepernick and him not being on a roster right now? Because like I said earlier,
the point was not to resolve anything, Damian Woody. The point was just to cause a spectacle and make a show. Hopefully you guys are starting to understand how these people maneuver, how they move, and what they're all about. Now, if you're Eric Reid, You're looking at Malcolm Jenkins. Okay, whatever. You think he's a sellout. He's also a grown man with a wife and children. You're going to walk up to him on the football field and do what? You're going to whoop his ass because, according to you, he quote-unquote sold out the movement? A so-called black man with a wife and children? You trying to act like he robbed you of some money or he took something from your family? Give me a break.
And you know, before the break, people who are opposed to this whole issue, guarantee you, they're sitting back right there rubbing their hands and see, here it is. These guys aren't even united on what they're both supposed to be fighting for right now. You understand? Like, that to me is my central issue with Eric Reid in this whole situation. You're both.
Well, that's not the central issue, brother. Once again, who cares what other people are thinking? Let's do the right thing for us, not for them. Also, at the end of the day, white people don't have to say that people like Eric Reid and Malcolm Jenkins are not on one accord in regards to what they want. Because anybody can see that they're not on one accord in regards to what they want. Because Eric Reid and Colin Kaepernick in particular, they have no idea what they want. I don't think that they ever thought that what they were doing would be commandeered by somebody else. I think that they thought that everybody would get behind that cult of personality and that energy that Kaepernick was emitting with his little silly protest. He thought everybody was just going to get naturally behind Kaepernick. And I say this all the time. It's hilarious to me. All of a sudden, Colin Kaepernick is supposed to be this great leader. His last 2 years with the 49ers before he decided to take a knee, he was known as the worst leader in the NFL. The man refused to make eye contact or communicate with his teammates. He walked around the locker room with headphones on. All you heard about Kaepernick was how many broads he was banging, how he stole Alden Smith's girlfriend, Ness Nitty. That's all you were hearing from their locker room. How he actually got into a big altercation with Alden Smith. I think Alden Smith stole his car and crashed it because he was mad that Kaepernick stole his woman, Ness Nitty. So, I mean, all this is just a bunch of balderdash.
You're both fighting for a cause, but you're doing it in different ways. It does no good to go out there and have a public display. And like I said, as a black man, it just hurts me to see two black men going out there and having that type of public display.
Well, Damian Woody, I have news for you. It doesn't embarrass me at all because it's not me, it's on them. They're the ones who have to understand the repercussions for their actions and the consequences for their thoughts. It doesn't embarrass me at all because I'm not living for the validation of the Caucasian like you two brothers are. That's why oftentimes y'all might get called a so-called coon or a sellout, even if the term might not be properly used in the proper context. If you're more concerned about what the Caucasian thinks about you and it's that important to you, then I have to question your other motivations in other areas because you're going to be fearful when it comes to certain things. When you're self-validated, you're going to do things from a much purer space. And you're also not going to be filled with all the emotional ass vitriol and want to attack and address the Caucasian all the time because you're going to understand we have to start with us. That's what it's about. It's not about going back and forth with them all fucking day. That shit is circular. It's never going to be resolved.
You're supposed to be fighting on the same team here. Well, you're supposed to be fighting for the same cause.
Well, first of all, Damien, you're absolutely right. But Max, let me take it a step further. You're not wrong with anything you're saying, Max. So I'm not talking to you as if you said something wrong. Please don't misunderstand. But let me be very, very clear. Let's get into the particulars. For example, the $89 million. Did y'all know that part of the agreement is that the owners will match whatever the players contribute up to $250,000 annually to certain causes pertaining to the African American community? The kind of issues that Colin Kaepernick and others were talking about addressing. We know this. If you don't know it, you know it now. Number two, the NFL, Colin Kaepernick himself, Eric Reid himself, they were never protesting against the National Football League and its owners.
Thank you, sir. And I have no idea why Eric Reid is trying to conflate that other than what's obvious. That being that he's more concerned about being a proxy representative of chaos than anything else. I mean, it's so glaring. You know, anybody could see it by now, or at least you should be able to.
They were protesting against society in terms of wanting to bring attention to racial oppression, racial inequality, and other things pertaining to disenfranchised communities throughout our nation. They were not complaining against the National Football League. Number three, when you talk about Malcolm Jenkins and the Players Coalition, They're saying their priority wasn't Colin Kaepernick. Their priority.
Nor should it have been. And as Josh Norman stated so well, he said, "Where's Colin at?" I probably should have done a video about that segment when it first emerged. If I can find that segment, I'll probably do a video on that. But Josh Norman exposed Colin Kaepernick.
Were the issues. We even have Josh Norman quoted on the
Ding.
beefing with Eric Reid over a conference call written by an article in our very own The Undefeated, where he was saying to Eric Reid, let's just be real about what's going on here. Where's Colin Kaepernick to speak up for himself? And oh, by the way, this is bigger than just one man. We understand that what's happening to Colin Kaepernick is wrong, but this issue is bigger than him. And if we're...
In order to eradicate the Colin Kaepernick narrative, one of these dudes that actually sees what's going on is going to have the courage to stand up and say, fuck Colin Kaepernick. It's much bigger than Colin Kaepernick. And his coward ass is running around trying to play dress up to make people think that he's Huey P. Newton reincarnated. Fuck him. We have to be concerned about our own and about the real issue. All it takes is one person to have the courage to do that. And I guarantee you the next day, Kaepernick is going to come out of hiding and all of a sudden start speaking on what he guesstimates the real issues are in the so-called black community. Once again, you have to understand, he cannot speak on what goes on in the so-called black community because he's not from the so-called black community. All he was, at least according to the official reports, a quote-unquote mixed race child that was raised in a white home, in a so-called white home, in a so-called white community. That's all he is. Somebody who got frustrated because he lost his job back in 2014 or 2015, and all of a sudden he got upset. He thought he was being treated like a Negro, put on some socks to piss people off, and next thing he knows, he's an internet sensation. And let me not forget, he also had a couple of his buttons pushed by Ness Nitty, and that long snapper, the former Green Beret.
Uplifting and helping our communities, that takes precedent.
Nate Boyer, that's his name, Nate Boyer. That's another guy, another handler that pushed Colin's buttons.
Back to Eric Reid. What is Eric Reid's real problem here? Max, you keep pointing to the numbers. You keep pointing to the deal, the intricacies of the deal itself. I'm willing to bet you my check that Eric Reid would not have a problem with the same exact deal that was reached if A, Colin Kaepernick had a job, and B, he was leading the front.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it, Stephen A. Smith. You're finally starting to understand what's going on, Stephen A. Smith. Congratulations, brother. I've been telling you this for 2 years now. It's good you're finally starting to catch on. Good for you.
Against the owners as opposed to Malcolm Jenkins, which means that the intricacies of the deal itself, while he may not like it, his real issue at the core of it all is his lack of trust for individuals that he doesn't believe are aligned with Colin Kaepernick's thinking. That is fair. I understand where he is coming from, but in the end, this wasn't about Colin Kaepernick, and it's not about you. And if you want to make it about how Colin Kaepernick, well, guess what? He took this knee, and he's the one that spearheaded this movement. Understand, in a roundabout way, and I'm being totally transparent here, it was really President Donald Trump.
Thank you, sir. I'm glad. Hey, you're Stephen A. Smith. Welcome to the channel, nigga. You finally starting to see the light. Damn. I was telling you that Donald Trump was the one who was going to terminate this whole storyline last year. I stated that. Donald Trump versus the woke meatheads. And you finally figured it out, Stephen A. Smith. Congratulations, man. I guess because that hairline going back is giving your brain more room to breathe.
Because if Donald Trump doesn't show up at that rally on September 22nd, 2017 in Huntsville, Alabama, and say, I'd file
Huntsville, Alabama, a.k.a. the NASA MK Ultra Center.
All those SOBs, Jerry Jones would have never kneeled. And the players wouldn't have locked arms in unison as one entity and brand. And they would have never been at the negotiating table with those owners because Colin Kaepernick's protest would have been exactly that. But Eric...
And if Colin Kaepernick really wanted to show his clout as being the great initiator for that whole situation, he would have showed up to the meeting. And he refused to do so. And they tried to concoct this lie that he was not invited. But there were more than enough players who stated that he was invited for me to know that he was. Between Josh Norman, Malcolm Jenkins, etc. But the reason why they don't want to hone in on the fact that Colin Kaepernick was invited but didn't show up is because they did not want to make it look like Colin Kaepernick was a piece of shit, was a liar, was a charlatan, whatever you want to call it. That's the main reason why they did not want to harp on the fact that Kaepernick did not show up to those meetings when he was prompted to. Because they didn't want to turn it into Colin Kaepernick is really not about what he's claiming to be about. I'm going to say it once again. If all it's going to take for this Colin Kaepernick narrative to go away is for one of these dudes that was on that committee or still on that committee to come out in public and state to hell with Colin Kaepernick, we have bigger fish to fry. Colin Kaepernick is a phony. But none of them want to do that because they're scared of how it's going to look. And they're scared of how the mainstream liberal sports media is going to try to attack that person who has the courage to do that.
He ignores that and in a process makes a public spectacle of himself, embarrasses himself, and highlights a problem that exists within our community because every single time somebody black disagrees with somebody else who is black, it can't be a disagreement. It's got to elevate to character assassination where somebody's a sellout, where I see points on both sides.
Yeah.
And I applaud, my last point is I applaud Malcolm Jenkins because Malcolm Jenkins was class personified yesterday, Damien, when he said, you couldn't pay me to address this subject. I am not going to insult my brother, especially to y'all. I wish Eric Reid was that kind of man on this particular Sunday.
Well, Eric Reid can't be that type of man because he's a man worshiper. But once again, I give Malcolm Jenkins credit for being shrewd and being prudent, because I'm sure that is not how he really feels about this situation. I'm sure that if he wanted to, he could drop a lot of dimes on Eric Reid and Colin Kaepernick. But he understands how it's going to look.
Stephen A. and Damien, I appreciate the point that it feels embarrassing when you have a movement, and this doesn't just happen with black people, Stephen A., or African Americans, which may make you feel better about it. This happens in all kinds of social movements. There are divisions, and between the more radical and the less radical. And the reason I bring up the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, and the break with the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, back when, in the 60s, is because...
Yeah, and the SNCC was started by Ella Baker, that closet lesbian. Brothers, look, once again, a lot of people are going to get upset by certain things that I say about the more notable figures that were associated with those different movements. They were pansexual, they were Luciferians. And what they would do, and when I say they, I'm talking about the organizers. The organizers were people like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin and Ella Baker. They were the organizers. They would go and they would recruit pastors and preachers because they knew that they had the ear of most of the regular so-called blacks of the South. They would recruit them, and basically they would promise them a certain amount of restitution for becoming aligned with a lot of those ideologies. And as we know, most pastors, even today, going back all the way to the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they're attention whores. So that's how that bond started. Because the civil rights movement was not based in so-called religion, it was based in rhetoric. And the so-called black preachers were the best orators. That's why they used Martin Luther King. All Martin Luther King was a mouthpiece. That's all he was. And the pressure started to get to him when he realized that there was no real end game that was going to be fruitful. That's why he had to express all his stress and his anxiety by beating up on prostitutes. All right? Because that's what he used to do. He used to go and have sex with a bunch of white prostitutes and beat up on them. All right? Allegedly. But that's what was going on. All right? And there are many people who know about that. Does not even talk about the pansexual orgies that they would have. And if you don't know what a pansexual is, look it up. Bayard Rustin and Abernathy and King and all those guys and those top preachers, as well as Aretha Franklin's father, C.L. Franklin, all engaging in pansexual orgies, all right? They're all venerators of Tammuz.
That represents the same sort of thing. The more radical element says your patient long game is not good enough. You know, as Martin Luther King said, justice postponed is justice denied, right? So we need justice now. And sometimes that division becomes public. And in this case, it became public. So when I say Eric Reid has a point, I like the way Malcolm Jenkins handled it very much. What I mean is they're kind of illustrating the difference that has occurred in the civil rights movement and in most social movements between the less radical and the more radical.
Or the faction that wants personal credit as opposed to the faction that actually wants to get things done. Yes, sometimes the partition is between the less radical and the more radical, but more often than not, the partition or the separation comes because one faction wants to make sure that they get all the credit or they get all of the esteem. And that's what's going on here.
All right, I thought
It's just an embarrassing situation. Like I said, on this day, Eric Reid is a smart brother.
Is he? Is he really? I would have to know what your definition for smart is and how he fits into that definition.
He's educated. He's a damn good football player, but he embarrassed himself on this Sunday afternoon. He's better than
Idolaters and man worshippers will always embarrass themselves. That's why I tell brothers, you're not supposed to be a fan of another man. Your woman and your children are supposed to be fans of yours. You're not supposed to be a fan of another man. Eric Reid is a fan of Colin Kaepernick. That's why he made a complete ass of himself on Sunday.
and it's a damn shame that he regressed to that point. It really is.
Here's the positive. All of their hearts are in the right place, right? Trying to help it.
How do you know that? How do you know what place their heart is in? I think it's in Jeremiah, the 17th chapter, and maybe like the 8th or the 9th verse, where it states, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" I know it's in Jeremiah 17, somewhere around the 8th or 9th verse. But this bro talking about their hearts in the right place. You don't know that. You're just talking shit.
At the end of the day, even if they don't see eye to eye. Yes. There's that. All right. Still